I want to say up front, for the panel's benefit, that I did not ask for any of this. I want that on record before we go any further. I arrived at Outer Station Kethvar on the 14th of the third quarter as a contracted civilian training consultant. Compact Garrison Operations had retained me, and I use the word retained loosely, because the contract rate was the kind of number that suggests whoever filed it had not looked at my service record, or had looked at it and concluded a man my age would be grateful for anything, to run a 12-week combat assessment program for their second cycle trainee cohort. 41 trainees, mixed species, standard compact garrison readiness parameters, nothing I hadn't done 11 times in the previous 4 years. I brought my kit bag, my field jacket, and a thermos that has survived more postings than most of the trainees I've assessed. I did not bring a handler certification, because I am not a handler. I did not bring a behavioral sciences background, because I do not have one. I brought 31 years of garrison experience and a working knowledge of how to tell a trainee that their footwork is going to get them killed, without making it personal. I want the panel to understand what kind of facility Outer Station Kethvar is, because I think it bears on everything that follows. It is a mid-tier compact frontier training hub. It has the budget of a mid-tier compact frontier training hub, which means it has the kind of paint on the walls that suggests it was applied once, in the early years of the station's operation, and has not been revisited since. The sparring floor in the main assessment arena is regulation composite, which is to say it is the cheapest regulation composite available, and it has been repaired in sections enough times that navigating it during a live session requires some awareness of which panels sit slightly higher than the others. I know which ones. By the end of week 1 I knew which ones. This is the kind of detail that matters when you are a combat instructor, and the difference between a clean throw and a twisted ankle is half a centimeter of misaligned flooring. The station runs 2 cohorts at a time, though when I arrived, one of those cohorts was completing its final assessment week and would be gone before I had finished orienting myself to the facility. The remaining cohort, mine, was 41 trainees in the second cycle, which is the cycle where the foundational skills from the first cycle are supposed to consolidate into something functional, and where, historically, the gap between trainees who are going to make it and trainees who need remediation becomes visible. The scores I had been forwarded suggested this cohort's gap was wider than average, particularly in stand-up work and ground control. I had 3 days before the first live session to understand the floor, map the problem, and decide where to put the weight. This did not leave a great deal of mental bandwidth for other concerns. The Sethrak were resident assessment animals. That is the official designation. What it means, practically speaking, is that the station had been granted stewardship of a pack of 4 Sethrak under a compact wildlife provisions cooperative assessment agreement, the terms of which I did not read before I arrived, and would not have fully understood if I had. The pack was used, periodically, for behavioral assessment training, teaching trainees to read predator signals, manage proximity situations, that kind of thing. And, through a reinforced gate, that I am told was rated to hold 4 times the pack's combined weight, a section of the outer yard. They were not, I was assured during my intake briefing, a hazard. They had a behavioral clearance rating of 7, which is the second highest tier, and means, as I subsequently learned, that they could be in proximity to non-handler personnel without a handler present, provided those personnel did not initiate contact, did not enter the designated pack space without clearance, and did not do anything that the behavioral officer, a young woman named Sev Moret, who I will speak to more in a moment, considered a provocation. I was told all of this. I nodded. I am sure I signed something. I was thinking about the sparring floor and the trainee readiness scores I had been forwarded, which suggested the cohort was behind the standard curve on their stand-up work and significantly behind on ground control, and I had a week to figure out how to address that before the first live assessment cycle. The Sethrak were not, at that moment, my primary operational concern. I met them on the morning of day 3. I run my sessions early. This is not a preference so much as a habit, worn into me over 3 decades of garrison postings, where the choice was run your session at dawn, or spend the rest of the day competing with everyone else who had decided the same facility at the same time was going to suit them. I was in the East Assessment Bay at 5:30 in the morning, running through my demonstration sequence for the day's footwork module, when I became aware that I had an audience. The Sethrak are, and I will try to be precise here, because I think precision matters, large. The alpha female, Orath, is what I would describe as transport vehicle-sized, if I were being generous, and transport vehicle-sized, if I were being accurate. She is midnight blue-black, which is a color that does not show up well in the bay's dawn lighting, and contributes to the impression, which I had in those first seconds, that a section of the wall had moved. Which means they are approximately the size of a medium-grade cargo loader, and carry themselves with the kind of quiet authority that suggests they have never once in their lives needed to demonstrate that they were dangerous, and have therefore never bothered. The subadult, Vorn, was at that time chest height on me, and still growing, with the slightly oversized paws and the slightly too large eyes of something that is not done becoming what it is going to become. All 4 of them were sitting at the perimeter of the East Assessment Bay. The gate, I noted, was open. I had not opened it. I subsequently learned that Sev Moret had left it on the standard overnight setting, which on that particular gate meant it would unlatch when the bay's environmental sensors logged dawn band light. This is not, I am told, standard procedure for stations where non-handler personnel use the bay before handler staff arrive. It was, at Outer Station Kethvar, simply what had always been done, because the Sethrak had never previously taken any interest in the bay when it was unoccupied. They looked at me. I am slightly deaf in my right ear, which is a courtesy gift from a training incident in my 14th year of service, and the subsonic chest pulse that the Sethrak produce, a vibration more than a sound, something you feel in the sternum before you register it anywhere else, registered first as a kind of pressure. It took me a moment to identify what it was. When I did, I finished the footwork sequence I had been running, because interrupting a demonstration sequence mid-movement is bad form, and the habits you practice in an empty bay are the habits you demonstrate in a full one. Then I looked at them again. Vorn had moved during the sequence. She was approximately 3 meters closer than she had been, and she was sitting with her head slightly tilted, watching the way that a dog watches something it finds genuinely interesting, rather than the way it watches something it is considering eating. This is a distinction I was not, at that time, qualified to make with any confidence, but it was the impression I had. The bioluminescent eye rings, amber, a shade of amber that reminds me of old garrison navigation beacons, were steady, not pulsing. Steady, I said, out loud, because talking to things when I am thinking is also a habit worn in over 30 years. You are going to tell me this counts as a provocation, aren't you? Nothing happened. Orath's eye rings did not change. The chest pulse continued at the same frequency. Vorn tilted her head the other direction. I went back to my demonstration sequence. This is approximately the level of drama with which the arrangement began. I reported it to Sev Moret when she arrived for her morning check at 6:30. I was factual about it. I told her the gate had been open. I told her the pack had been in the bay perimeter when I arrived. I told her they had remained for approximately 40 minutes, and then, at some point, while I was working through the back half of the sequence, had gone back through the gate without me noticing. Sev Moret listened to all of this, with the expression of someone who is processing information that does not fit any existing category she has. Then she said she would check the overnight sensor logs. She came back 40 minutes later and told me the pack had been sitting at the bay perimeter for 2 hours before I arrived. I did not know what to do with this information, so I filed it in the section of my mind reserved for things that are not immediately my problem, and went to run the first session of the day. By the end of week 1, it had happened 5 more times. I want to be clear about the nature of these occurrences, because I think the panel may be imagining something more dramatic than what actually took place. The Sethrak would arrive, via the unlatch at dawn gate, and position themselves at the perimeter of the East Assessment Bay. They did not enter the active training space. They did not approach the trainees, who ranged in their reactions from professional discomfort to barely concealed terror. They did not vocalize at any frequency I could consciously hear, though Sev Moret, who began attending my morning sessions from day 4 onward, told me the subvocal chest pulse was present and consistent throughout. They watched. When I moved through the demonstration sequences, Vorn, consistently Vorn, not the adults, though the adults were always there, would track the movement with the kind of attention that I associate, in trainees, with someone who is genuinely trying to learn something, rather than waiting for the session to end. At the end of each morning session, when I called the session closed and began my cool-down walk along the perimeter, the pack would disengage. Not immediately. There was usually a period of 3 to 5 minutes during which they simply held position while the trainees filed out, and then, without any signal I could identify, they would move back through the gate in single file. Orath last. Sev Moret described this, in the behavioral log she maintained, as anomalous voluntary session attendance. She told me she had never seen the pack display directed observational interest in a non-handler before. She asked if I had done anything in particular on the first morning. I told her I had run a footwork demonstration sequence. She asked what kind. I told her. She wrote it down. I am told she subsequently spent several evenings reviewing everything she could find in the compact wildlife behavioral database about Sethrak observational learning patterns, which I think speaks well of her professionalism, and also suggests she had more time to spend on it than I did. Week 2 brought a development I had not anticipated. The trainees began using the Sethrak's positioning as a calibration signal. Not consciously. I think they would not have admitted to it if I had asked, but I noticed it. When the pack was present at the gate perimeter, the trainees performed noticeably better. The quality of attention in the room was different. There is a thing that happens in a training session when everyone present is genuinely focused, when the ambient noise of anxiety and self-consciousness drops away, and what is left is the work itself. And I had experienced it in garrison training halls and in advanced assessment programs, and in a handful of particularly good contract cohorts over the years. It happened in the East Assessment Bay at Outer Station Kethvar on the mornings, when 4 large predators were sitting at the gate, watching. The mechanism, as best I could work out, was not fear, or not only fear. A trainee who is afraid makes mistakes differently than a trainee who is focused. Fear produces flinching, over-rotation, a tendency to tighten the wrong muscle groups at the wrong moment. What I was seeing was something else. They were deliberate. They were moving with the kind of care that comes from a heightened awareness, that every action is visible and being evaluated, not by the instructor who has already seen everything they can do wrong, but by something that does not grade on a curve. The Sethrak were not grading them. They were, as far as I could determine, simply watching. But the effect was the same. I mentioned this to Sev Maret. She said she had noticed it too and was logging it. She had started arriving early enough to document when the pack positioned itself and was correlating the timing with the session assessment scores. The correlation was, by her preliminary analysis, statistically significant. I told her I thought the mechanism was probably simple. The trainees were working harder because the ambient stakes had been raised, and she said she agreed, but wanted to document it properly regardless. I respected that. Documentation done well is how arrangements like this survive administrative review, which is a lesson I learned in year 7 of my garrison career, and have never forgotten. Sev Maret and I began having what I can only describe as briefings. She would arrive for my session, observe, document, and then afterward, while Vorn had not yet taken to staying, was still departing with the adults, we would sit on the equipment cases along the south wall and she would tell me what she had seen and I would tell her what I had seen, and we would compare the two accounts. She had a way of describing predator behavior that was simultaneously technical and direct, which I appreciated. She did not use jargon to obscure uncertainty. When she did not know something, she said she did not know it, and said what she thought might be true, and why. This is a rare quality in people who are expert at something, and I noted it. She told me, in week 3, that Vorn's attention to the drop-step transition was not random. She had cross-referenced it against the behavioral database and found a documented behavioral cluster in juvenile Sethrak that involved tracking fast-change weight transfers in other moving bodies, which she described as a component of what the database called pursuit calibration, the instinct, in a pack predator, to understand exactly how a body moves in order to be able to predict where it is going to be next. The implication being that Vorn was not watching the footwork sequence because she found it aesthetically interesting. She was filing it, in whatever the Sethrak equivalent of memory is, as information about how the thing she had decided to follow moved. I told Sevmaret that was not entirely comfortable information to have. She said she understood that, and that she would make sure the behavioral logs documented it clearly, which would ensure that any administrative review of the arrangement would have the full context. I told her that was probably wise. She said that Vorn was not calibrating for pursuit in a predatory sense. The database was clear that this behavioral cluster in anchor-adopted individuals reads differently from the same cluster in threat targets, but that she wanted me to have the information rather than not have it. I appreciated that. 31 years of garrison service teaches you that the information you do not have more dangerous than the information that makes you uncomfortable, and the only way to get the information you do not have is to be the kind of person people tell things to. Weeks 2 and 3, the pattern held. Weeks 4 and 5, it changed. Vorn began staying after the other 3 left. Not by much. 10 minutes the first time, 20 the second. But consistently, she would hold position at the bay perimeter, while Oreth, Kale, and Desh filed back through the gate, and then she would remain, watching me run the post-session documentation review on my kit screen, and then at some point she would leave. I noticed it. I noted it to Sev Maret. Sev Maret added it to the behavioral log. On the 4th occasion, Vorn did not stay at the bay perimeter. She crossed to the assessment bench along the east wall, and sat down approximately 1.5 meters from where I was running my post-session documentation, and she put her chin on her forepaws and went to sleep. I want to describe this clearly for the panel. A Sethrak subadult in full resting posture is approximately the size of the assessment bench itself. The chin on forepaws position leaves the eye rings visible, amber and faintly luminous, and from where I was sitting with my kit screen, I could see the cartilaginous chest plates, iridescent silver-white where the light catches the edges of them, rising and falling with the slow cadence of an animal that has decided it is somewhere safe. I did my post-session documentation. This is, to the best of my knowledge, when the arrangement solidified. From that morning forward, Vorn's presence in the East Assessment Bay after sessions was consistent. The adults continued to attend the morning sessions from the gate perimeter, and then depart. Vorn stayed. In the 6th week, she began staying through the mid-morning break as well, which meant she was present when I ran the technical review sessions that followed. In the 7th week, she moved from the assessment bench to the floor between the bench and the wall, which is a narrower space and required her to fold herself in a way that struck me as somewhat inconvenient, but she appeared to prefer it. I speculated, later, that it placed my position between her and the bay entrance, though at the time I attributed it to nothing more than the fact that the floor there is slightly warmer due to the conduit running underneath it. I should tell the panel about the morning in week 6 when I arrived, and found Oreth sitting alone at the bay perimeter at 4 in the morning. This was not a gate unlatched situation. The gate was closed. Oreth had, as near as Sev Maret could determine from the sensor logs, gone around the fence. She was not inside the training space. She was on the perimeter walkway, between the fence and the outer wall, in a position that the sensor logs subsequently indicated she held for the duration of my session, and then an additional hour afterward. Sev Maret described this position in the behavioral log as consistent with territorial boundary monitoring. I described it, in my own documentation, as the fence being on the outside of where the large predator was sitting, which I thought was worth noting even if it did not seem to be causing any operational difficulty. 3 days later, Kale and Desh were doing the same thing. By week 7, the dawn perimeter walk, Oreth, then Kale, then Desh, working the outer fence line in a circuit that began before my arrival and ended approximately 20 minutes after I entered the bay, was a daily occurrence. Sev Maret logged it carefully. She had taken to arriving even earlier than I did to document the start times, which I think reflects a level of professional commitment that ought to be noted somewhere in the facility record. Though I recognize that is not strictly within this panel's remit, she told me, during one of our morning conversations after a session, that the circuit was consistent, same route, same order, same intervals, and that the pack resumed resting positions immediately after completing it, without any apparent anxiety or hypervigilance. They were not nervous, she said. They were organized. The trainees noticed before I registered the full significance of it. Trainees are, in my experience, better at noticing the social environment than they are at the technical work, which is why I have spent 31 years teaching the technical work. A third-cycle female named Orvek Seld, solid trainee, the best ground control instincts in the cohort, slightly overconfident in her upper body strikes, which I had been working on with her, asked me in week 7 whether I had a handler certification I had not mentioned in my intake profile. I told her I did not. She said, "Then why does the senior pack member do perimeter before your sessions?" I told her I did not know, and suggested she return her attention to the footwork drill. A male trainee, Keth Vorath, second lowest scores in the cohort on stand-up balance. Excellent instincts on close contact reads. Made a different observation at the end of week 7, he said, while helping break down the equipment after a session, that he had noticed the subadult was watching the drop-step transition specifically, not the whole sequence, just that part. I told him to write down what he had noticed and turn it in with his weekly assessment log. He looked at me like I had asked him to do something absurd, and then he wrote it down. A third observation came from an unexpected direction. One of the older trainees in the cohort, a male named Dorath Vesk, 32, who had spent 6 years in civilian logistics before enrolling in the garrison program, and brought to his training the particular combination of competence and frustration that characterizes people who have done real work before and are not accustomed to being told they are doing it wrong, stopped me outside the bay after a session in week 7 and said he had a question. He asked whether I was aware that the 3 adults positioned differently when I was demonstrating versus when the trainees were working. I told him I had not observed that specifically. He said, "When I demonstrate, Kale and Desh both face inward, toward the floor. When the trainees are working, one of them faces inward, and one faces the entrance." He had been tracking it for 4 sessions. He thought I should know. I thanked him, and told him his lateral footwork had improved significantly since week 4, and that if he kept at the same trajectory he would be above standard by the assessment. He looked like he expected more of a reaction to what he had told me. I think he expected surprise, or concern, or at minimum, some acknowledgement that what he was describing was unusual. It was unusual, but I had been teaching for 31 years, in environments where the unusual is more common than the administrative structure prefers to acknowledge, and a pack of predators rotating one member to face the entrance when I am not the one doing the visible work is simply the kind of detail that you file and think about later. I thought about it. The conclusion I reached, which Sev Merritt later confirmed was consistent with the database, is that Kale and Desh were maintaining perimeter awareness specifically calibrated to whether the individual they were monitoring was occupied or available to perceive a threat. When I was moving, demonstrating, I was not scanning the entrance. One of them was. When I was stationary and could see the entrance myself, both could face inward. The division of attention was collaborative and had been running for at least 4 sessions before a trainee noticed it and thought to tell me. I found this, as I find most things I cannot immediately categorize, worth noting, and then proceeding. I am aware that this panel is reviewing the events of week 10 primarily. I am giving this amount of detail about the preceding weeks because I think the panel needs to understand that what happened in week 10 was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a 10-week sequence of events, each of which was documented, each of which was reported, each of which the Compact Training Authority's Operational Compliance Division had access to through the Regional Reporting Database, and none of which prompted any inquiry or guidance until someone in that division noticed the documentation volume and sent a coordinator. The morning inventory did not begin on the morning coordinator Sand arrived. It had been running for 3 weeks before she set foot in the facility. If anyone in the Operational Compliance Division had read the logs at any earlier point, the situation would have been considerably easier for everyone to navigate. I make this observation for the record, not as a complaint. In week 8, Kale and Desh began attending not from the outer fence, but from the gate perimeter itself, which Sev Merritt had started leaving on the dawn unlatched setting, because, as she told me, it seemed discourteous not to. They did not enter the active floor. They sat at the threshold. If a trainee went down hard, as trainees do, this is the nature of ground control training. They tracked the fall and tracked the recovery, and when the trainee got up, they reset. If I called a stop and went to check on someone, they tracked me across the floor and tracked me back. Not alarm, not threat posture. The kind of attention that suggests a watch is being kept without anyone having formally asked that it be kept. By week 8, I had begun running my cool-down walk differently. I had always walked the perimeter after calling a session. It is how I decompress. Has been since my 2nd year of garrison service. But I had been doing the east wall last, and then cutting across the center to the bench. In week 8, I found myself doing the full perimeter, all 4 walls, before going to the bench. The reason, which I will acknowledge to the panel with some embarrassment, is that this was the route that gave Kale and Desh the longest sightlines as I moved, and I had noticed, sometime in week 7, that they reset their gait position more smoothly when I completed the full circuit. I am a training instructor. I spend 31 years calibrating movement to produce predictable responses. I calibrated without entirely meaning to. Sev Merritt, when I told her this, wrote it down without comment, then looked up and said she thought the panel would find it significant. I asked her why. She said because it meant the adjustment ran both directions. I told her to put that in the log too. Sev Merritt called it a proximity covenant in her behavioral log. She sent me the relevant section of the Compact Wildlife Behavioral Database that described the behavioral cluster, the dawn perimeter work, the directed observational attendance, the subadult's resting proximity, the adult escort positioning during perceived risk activities. She highlighted one phrase, which I have memorized because it seems relevant to this panel. Anchor individual adoption, Class 2. Characteristics include voluntary territorial protection behavior, extended to a non-pack individual deemed by the pack to occupy an equivalent social or functional role. I want to be honest with the panel. I did not fully understand what that meant when I first read it. I understood it better after week 9, when I was running a demonstration of a takedown variant and went down harder than I intended on a section of the composite floor that sits higher than the others, the one near the north end of the sparring lane, which I know about and had simply misjudged in the middle of a moving demonstration, and got up to find all 4 Sethrak inside the bay perimeter, in positions that Sev Merritt later described as full protective encirclement response. I told them I was fine. Orath held her position for 45 seconds, watching me with the amber eye rings that don't change when nothing is wrong. And then she sat back on her haunches, and Kale and Desh returned to the gate threshold, and Vorn, who had crossed from the east wall to a position approximately 2 meters from me, in less time than I would have thought physically possible for something her size, sat down and leaned her shoulder against my left leg. She weighs, as of the last facility health assessment, 208 kilograms. She was leaning gently, which I will note for the panel, because I want to be precise about this. The pressure was the kind of pressure you feel when a very large, very warm, very calm animal decides you are the thing it wants to be next to, and I have never had that experience before in 56 years. And I will be honest with the panel that I stood there for a moment and simply let it be what it was before I went back to the session. "22 of them, at various points around the sparring floor. When I called the session back into order, they returned to their positions without comment, but there was a quality to the remainder of that session, a focus, a weight, that I can only describe as everyone present understanding, without anyone having said it out loud, that what had just happened was not something that happens by accident. I gave the cohort's session assessment for that morning the highest collective score I had assigned in the program to that point. They had earned it. After the session, Sev Merritt and I sat on the equipment cases along the south wall, and she did not say anything for a while, which I took to mean she was organizing what she wanted to say, rather than that she had nothing to say. Then she said she wanted to walk me through what had just occurred from a behavioral standpoint, which I said was a good idea. She said the encirclement response is a documented Sethrak pack behavior associated with a perceived threat to the anchor individual. The trigger is not necessarily a visible threat. It can be an unexpected change in the anchor individual's movement signature. Going down unexpectedly, outside of a movement sequence the pack recognizes, registers to the pack the same way a threat would register, because the result, the anchor individual on the ground, is the same either way. Because by the time the cause is identifiable, the response needs to have already begun. I asked her what that meant, practically, for my sessions. She said it meant the pack had been paying close enough attention to my movement patterns over 9 weeks that they could distinguish between an expected fall, which is what a training demonstration looks like, and an unexpected one. She said she would add that to the behavioral log as a significant indicator. I asked her what it indicated. She said it indicated that the anchor individual adoption was Class 2 and not Class 1, which she had suspected but had not had clear confirmation of until that morning. Class 1 is conditional and proximity dependent. Class 2 is unconditional and comprehensive. The pack, she said, was not simply maintaining awareness of my general location and state. They had built a behavioral model of how I move, and the model was specific enough to produce a response to a discrepancy. I told her I was going to need a moment to consider what that meant. She said that was reasonable. This is the situation as it stood when Regional Compliance Coordinator Briva Sand arrived at Outer Station Kethvar in the 10th week of my contract. I was not the one who contacted the training authority. I want to make this clear as well. Sevmaret had been filing her behavioral logs through the standard facility documentation channel, which at Outer Station Kethvar feeds into the regional reporting database, which is reviewed, apparently, by the Training Authority's Operational Compliance Division, which had noted the growing volume of entries from a facility where the behavioral log output had previously averaged 3 entries per month and was now producing, by Sevmaret's careful documentation practices, closer to 40. Someone in operational compliance had flagged it. Coordinator Sand had been dispatched to assess what was being described in her dispatch order, as I later learned, as unsanctioned cross-species proximity between a non-handler civilian contractor and resident pack assessment animals. She arrived on a Tuesday, in the 2nd week of month 3. I did not know she was coming. The facility commander, a compact garrison officer named Horev Seld, no relation to the trainee Orvek, though I had wondered, told me on the morning of her arrival that a compliance coordinator was on site and would be observing my morning session. I said fine. I have been observed before. 31 years of garrison service involves a significant volume of performance reviews, administrative assessments, and various inspections by people who have the authority to inspect things. I have learned to treat observers the way I treat weather. Acknowledge them as a condition, adapt as needed, proceed. Coordinator Sand was a compact, precise woman. I use compact in the size sense, not the organizational affiliation sense, though both happen to apply, in her mid-40s, with the kind of organized efficiency that suggests someone who has spent a long time doing a job that requires a great deal of order. She introduced herself in the facility corridor before my session, and asked whether I was aware of the behavioral documentation concerning the Sethrak Pack's interaction with my training activities. I told her I was. She asked whether I had any handler certification or behavioral training background. I told her I did not. She made a note. Then she said she would be observing my session that morning and would need to speak with me and with Sev Maret afterward. I said fine and went to the East Assessment Bay. The session that morning was a ground control technical review for the second half of the cohort, 20 trainees, working in pairs on control transitions, with individual assessment intervals. The Sethrak were present in the configuration that had become standard by that point. Orath, Kale, and Desh at the gate threshold. Vorn inside the bay, on the east wall near the assessment bench. The dawn perimeter walk had concluded before I arrived, as it always did, and the pack had settled into their session positions with the quiet efficiency they had developed over 10 weeks. I ran the session. Coordinator Sand observed from the bay's upper observation ledge, which is a narrow walkway along the south wall that gives a view of the full floor. I was aware of her presence the way I am aware of all observers, peripherally, without letting it alter the session. I ran the first assessment intervals at the standard pace, made 2 corrections on a trainee whose transition footwork had regressed since the previous week, and was moving into the third interval when I became aware that Coordinator Sand had come down from the observation ledge. She was crossing the active assessment floor. I will note for the panel, the floor was active, 20 trainees in pair work at standard intensity. There are safety conventions regarding non-participant movement on an active floor that are, in my experience, understood by everyone who regularly observes training sessions. The observation ledge exists precisely so that observers do not need to be on the approaching the situation. She had reached a conclusion and was implementing it, and the details of the floor between her and the implementation were not part of her assessment. I called a hold. The trainees cleared space. Coordinator Sand crossed to where I was standing at the east wall near the assessment bench. She had her documentation device in hand. Vorn was approximately 1.5 meters to my left in her standard resting position, head up now, watching the coordinator approach. The amber eye rings were visible and did not change. Coordinator Sand stopped 2 meters from me and began asking questions. She asked, again, about my handler certification. I told her, again, that I did not have one. She asked whether I understood that sustained proximity contact with a Class 7 behavioral clearance pack constituted a significant deviation from Compact Training Authority non-handler proximity guidelines. I told her I was aware of the behavioral log documentation and had relied on Sev Maret's professional judgment regarding what constituted appropriate proximity. She said that the behavioral log documentation was, in fact, one of her concerns, that the volume of documentation suggested a pattern of ongoing proximity that was beyond what the non-handler guidelines contemplated, that it was her assessment, pending full review, that the arrangement needed to be interrupted in order to return the pack to standard facility protocol. I said I understood her position. She looked at Vorn. She said, "I'll need the subadult removed from this space for the remainder of the session." I said that I did not have the authority or the physical capacity to remove a 208-kilogram animal from a space it had voluntarily occupied, and that Sev Moret was the appropriate person to consult on pack management. Coordinator Sand said that Sev Moret was upstairs completing the observation documentation, and she did not want to interrupt the session to locate her. Then she stepped forward and put her hand on Vorn's scruff. I want to be precise about what I mean by put her hand on Vorn's scruff. She reached out and took a grip on the loose fur at the back of the subadult's neck, the way you would grip a large domesticated animal to guide it from one place to another. It was not a violent gesture. It was the gesture of someone who has a plan and is implementing it and expects the plan to work because plans usually work. The chest pulse stopped. I do not mean it became quieter. I mean the subsonic vibration that had been a continuous background presence in that bay for 10 weeks. The pressure in the sternum, the thing you stop noticing because it is always there, simply stopped. The silence it left was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence a room has after someone drops something and everything is waiting to find out how bad the sound is going to be. Vorn did not move. Orath moved. She covered the distance between the gate threshold and the east wall in approximately 3 seconds. I know this because the facility sensor log timestamps the motion detection events, and the interval between the gate threshold trigger and the east wall trigger is 3.2 seconds. And Orath weighs, at her last assessment, 461 kilograms. Kale and Desh were half a second behind her. The three of them positioned themselves in a configuration that I can only describe as deliberate. Orath directly between Coordinator Sand and the bay entrance, Kale and Desh flanking at angles that made the east assessment wall, which is where I was standing, and where Vorn was still sitting with Coordinator Sand's hand on her scruff, into the single direction in which a person could theoretically move that was not currently occupied by an apex predator. Coordinator Sand released Vorn's scruff. I cannot speak to what exactly was happening inside the coordinator's mind at this point, and I would not want to speculate. I can say that she released the scruff and did not make any further moves, which strikes me in retrospect as an extremely sensible decision. Vorn stood up, turned around once, and lay back down in exactly the position she had been in before. The amber eye rings stayed amber. The subsonic chest pulse resumed, slow and even. Orath did not move. I want to be specific about this for the panel. Orath positioned herself with her chest plate approximately 40 centimeters from Coordinator Sand's left side and did not move. She did not vocalize at any frequency that I could consciously hear, though the behavioral log indicates the pack was producing a subvocal communication pattern that Sev Moret, who had appeared at the bay entrance at some point during the initial movement. She had been on the observation ledge, not upstairs completing documentation, as the coordinator had apparently assumed, documented as an active territorial declaration vocalization, non-escalating. Non-escalating means, as Sev Moret subsequently explained to me, that the pack had communicated its position and established its boundaries and was not, at that moment, planning to do anything further. It was, in her assessment, a declarative response rather than an attack response. The territory had been identified, the boundary had been drawn. The pack was holding it. This holding lasted 22 minutes. I finished the session. This is the part that I suspect some members of this panel may find difficult to credit, so I want to explain my reasoning. The trainees were still present. They had stopped their pair work at the moment of Orath's transit across the floor, which is understandable and probably good situational awareness on their part, and they were all standing at the north end of the sparring lane watching. Coordinator Sand was standing at the east wall with Orath's chest plate 40 centimeters from her left side. Sev Moret was at the bay entrance documenting. The session had approximately 20 minutes of scheduled assessment time remaining. I called the cohort back to their pair work positions and finished the assessment intervals. I want to explain this to the panel. The session had a purpose. The trainees had work to complete. Disrupting the session would have solved nothing. Orath's position was not going to change because I stopped the session. The only thing that would have changed is that the trainees would have spent the next 20 minutes standing at the north end of the sparring lane doing nothing useful. The trainees who completed their assessment intervals that morning, working through them calmly, while a compact compliance coordinator stood, held against the east wall by a 461-kilogram predator, received, in my assessment, some of the best under-stress performance scores I have recorded in 11 years of contract consulting. The ambient conditions, while unusual, were clarifying. Trainee Keth Vorath, for the record, produced a clean control transition in that session that I have not seen him replicate since, which tells me it is in him, and tells me something about what it takes to pull it out of him. I made a note. I called the session closed at the scheduled time. Sev Merritt, who had been on her documentation device for most of the 22 minutes, came fully into the bay at that point and spoke to the Sethrak. She is the behavioral officer. She knows the protocols. She spoke to Orath at a frequency and in a register that I cannot reproduce, and that I will not try to describe because I do not have the training to describe it accurately, and over the following 3 minutes, the pack's configuration shifted. Kale and Desh moved first, returning to the gate threshold. Orath held for another 45 seconds, watching the coordinator, watching me, watching Sev Merritt, processing something in whatever way a Sethrak processes things. And then she turned and crossed back to the gate in the same 3 seconds it had taken her to cross in the other direction, which suggested, to my admittedly untrained eye, that the 3 seconds had been deliberate pacing and not a reflection of maximum possible speed. Vorn stayed another 10 minutes. She does that. Coordinator Son did not speak during this process. She remained against the east wall until Orath had cleared the bay and the gate had closed behind the pack, and then she crossed to the exit and left without completing her compliance review conversation with me. The panel has received Sev Merritt's full incident report and behavioral documentation, so I will not attempt to reproduce the technical content. I will tell you what Sev Merritt told me afterward, because I think it is relevant to the panel's assessment of what occurred. She told me the Sethrak's 22-minute holding pattern was not an attack. She told me this was important to understand. The pack had the capacity to have made the situation much worse for Coordinator Sond, and had chosen not to. What they had done was hold a boundary, establish, with the precision and patience of an apex predator, that does not need to demonstrate its capabilities, because the capabilities are simply true, that the person who had reached into their declared territory and put a hand on their sub-adult was not going to be able to do anything else until the pack decided she could. No injury, no escalation, no wasted action. Sev Merritt called it a correction, a precise and proportionate correction. She filed it in the behavioral log as Morning Inventory, Phase 2. Her reasoning, which she explained to me with the careful patience of someone who is genuinely invested in a subject, and is aware she is speaking to someone with no background in it, was that the pack's dawn perimeter walk, the daily check of the outer fence line, the verification that the facility environment was as they had last left it, the documentation of their anchor individual's position and safety, had been designated in her log as Morning Inventory for the previous 3 weeks as an Article 14 Behavioral Covenant entry. Phase 2, she said, was what happens when the inventory reveals a discrepancy. The discrepancy had been a hand on Vorn's scruff. The response had been proportionate, targeted, non-escalating, and precisely calibrated to the level of the interference. This is, Sev Merritt told me, consistent with observed Sethrak territorial correction behavior in every documented case in the Compact Wildlife Behavioral Database. She also told me that in those documented cases, the individuals who had been held were uniformly described, afterward, as having a very clear understanding of what the territorial designation meant, and a strong disinclination to test it again. I cannot speak to Coordinator Son's understanding. I can speak to what happened next. The compliance review that Coordinator Sond had been dispatched to conduct was suspended, pending a protocol review of whether her own actions during the observed session constituted a violation of Compact Training Authority non-handler animal contact guidelines, which prohibit, in Section 4, subsection B, the initiation of physical contact with any resident Compact Wildlife Provisions stewardship animal by a non-handler supervised personnel member. The guidelines were, I understand, written primarily to protect the animals. They work in both directions. The facility behavioral officer's documentation of the incident was reviewed by the Compact Wildlife Provisions Regional Authority within 48 hours. The Morning Inventory designation, both Phase 1, the dawn perimeter work, and Phase 2, the territorial correction event, was formally entered into the Compact Wildlife Covenant Registry under Article 14 as an Anchor Individual Covenant designation. I am the anchor individual. I did not request this designation. I do not have a handler certification. I am a 56-year-old retired Compact Garrison combat instructor with a slightly deaf right ear and a thermos that has seen better days. Contracted at a rate that suggests whoever filed the paperwork has never checked what a contract instructor costs in this part of the frontier. The Article 14 designation has specific operational implications. It means that any action by Compact administrative or compliance personnel that disrupts or attempts to disrupt the PAC's voluntary protective behavioral cluster around the designated anchor individual constitutes an interference with a formally recognized wildlife covenant, which is a separate and more significant category of violation than the one Coordinator Sond had been dispatched to assess. It means that the removal of Vorn from the East Assessment Bay, which was what Coordinator Sond had been attempting, was not, under Article 14, within her authority to direct. It means, as the regional authorities' review noted in its formal determination, that the operational status of the PAC's morning inventory activities was not a subject for Training Authority compliance review without wildlife provisions oversight, and that the Training Authority's Operational Compliance Division's dispatch of a coordinator to assess unsanctioned cross-species proximity without first consulting wildlife provisions represented a procedural gap that the regional authority intended to address through formal interdepartmental protocol revision. Coordinator Sond's compliance review of my activities at Outer Station Kethvar was closed without findings. Her own protocol review remained open as of the last document I received before this panel convened. I completed my contract at Outer Station Kethvar 3 weeks after these events. 41 trainees, 12-week program, standard Compact Garrison readiness parameters. The final assessment scores were the best I have produced in 4 years of contract work. And I say this not as a boast, but as an observation about what 11 weeks of training under consistent environmental pressure, even environmental pressure of an unconventional kind, will produce in a cohort that is paying attention. Trainee Orvex Seld improved her upper body strike calibration to within standard garrison parameters by the final week. I made a note in her file. Her ground control was already above standard and is going to be better still if she keeps at it. Keth Vorath's stand-up balance improved 7 points over the program, which is more than I expected when I read his intake scores, and more than he expected when I told him how much ground he had to cover. He argued with me about it once, early on, which is a thing trainees do, and which I understand as a form of processing the information. I let him finish, then ran him through the drill sequence again. He stopped arguing. I arrived at the East Assessment Bay at 5:30. The gate was unlocked. The Sethrak were already there, Orath, Kale, Desh at the perimeter, Vorn at the east wall in her position between the bench and the warm section of floor above the conduit. I ran my demonstration sequence. The footwork module, the one I had been running on the morning of day 3, 10 weeks before. Vorn tracked it, the same head tilt in the same direction, at the same point in the sequence where she had tilted it the first time, which is the transition from the lateral movement into the drop step, the part of the sequence where the visual rhythm changes. I had noticed it weeks earlier and had been curious about it, and had not found a way to ask that would produce a useful answer. I ran the transition twice, cleanly, and then a third time at reduced speed, and Vorn's head tilt on the slow version was more pronounced. She was watching the weight shift, I think, the moment where the center of gravity transfers. But I am a combat instructor, not a Sethrak behavioral specialist, and I could be wrong. I finished the sequence. I did my post-session documentation on the kit screen. Vorn put her chin on her forepaws. Orith, outside the gate, walked the perimeter once more, and then sat down. I packed my kit bag. I put the thermos in the outer pocket where it fits without me having to angle it, I said, out loud, because I still talk to things when I am thinking, and I have given up trying to change it. You'll have to find someone else for the morning session. Nothing happened. The amber eye rings did not change. The chest pulse continued at its steady, familiar frequency. I left. Sev Marit sent me the behavioral log entry 3 days later. She had logged my departure and the pack's response to it, which she described as a 3-day perimeter walk frequency increase and a sustained presence at the East Assessment Bay Gate during the hours that corresponded to my previous session schedule. Then, on the 4th day, a new morning session had been assigned to the bay. A different contractor, different cohort, different work, and the pack had attended. Oroth had done the perimeter walk first, then they had positioned at the gate. Sev Marit noted, at the end of the entry, that the new contractor was a younger woman, early 30s, who had apparently arrived on day 1 to find a Sethrak subadult already in the East Assessment Bay at 5:30 in the morning, sitting in the warm spot by the conduit, and had, according to the sensor log, sat down on the assessment bench and opened her kit screen and gotten to work. Sev Maret wrote, at the very end, that she thought the contractor was going to be fine. I think so too. That is everything I have to tell this panel. I would add only that I was not, at any point in this arrangement, intending to circumvent Compact Training Authority non-handler guidelines, nor was I encouraging the pack's activities, nor was I in any way attempting to cultivate a behavioral relationship with a Class 7 cleared predator pack. I arrived at Outer Station Kethvar to run a training program. I ran it. The morning sessions happened to be early. The gate happened to be on the dawn unlatched setting. The Sethrak happened to find the footwork sequence interesting. I do not know what an apex predator finds interesting in a 56-year-old retired combat instructor. I assume it is something I do not have the framework to understand, and would not understand even if someone explained it to me in precise detail. What I know is that 11 weeks of training ran clean, 41 trainees completed their assessment program, and a compliance coordinator who put her hand where the pack had decided hands should not go, spent 22 minutes considering the consequences of that decision from a distance of 40 centimeters. The morning inventory was already filed. She just hadn't read it.